You're listening to the Penteract Poetry Podcast, hosted by Anthony Etherin.
Welcome to the Penteract Poetry Podcast, Episode 2. My guest this time is Steven J Fowler, a poet, a performer, a playwright, an artist, and a curator. He is also director of the Writers' Centre Kingston and of the European Poetry Festival. I spoke with Steven a few weeks ago, and we discussed visual poetry, avant-gardism, the purpose of poetry, as well as the different poetic traditions and tastes throughout Europe. I began by asking him how and why he became a poet.
So my route into poetry perhaps is somewhat atypical in the sense that before the age of maybe 23, 24, which is just over a decade ago, I had never read really any poetry apart from that which was given in GCSE English at school, which I didn't concentrate on and have no memory of, although I assume I know who it is, Caroline Duffy and T.S. Eliot. And it basically came into my life in the most accidental way. And that really has informed and underpinned an enormous amount of what I've done since, I think, with a sense of naivety and curiosity, because I was in a strange, unhappy job, just working in like a bank or something generic in London, and then fled that, trying to find some sort of solace in an unreachable part of the world, traveling a lot. And on one of those travels, I happened to go into a charity shop and find a couple of small anthologies, the Penguin's 70s European Poets and the Norton Anthology, and I took them with me. And I'd never read poetry, and I just thought, I remember even speaking against it. It was just obfuscation and just irritating and annoying. So yeah, I came back to London at maybe 24 years of age, discovering that because of my hyperlinguistic, oversensitive thought processes, that there might be a creative output in poetry for me all at once, suddenly, because of random chance of this charity shop and this travel. And I came back and I signed up to a master's at Birkbeck, which happened to be the place of the Contemporary Poetics Research Centre with Will Rowe and Carol Watts and Stephen Mooney. And just by chance, I discovered them, emailed them, and they kind of introduced me to some of the people who I then would get to know. So it all happened at once, with no pre-introduction, with no sense of what it might be, and was just the thing that saved me from a life that I wasn't enjoying. So my experience of it was entirely personal and emancipatory. So that's how I kind of conceive of it in my life, as a random thing that came in and altered my path.
So, well, this book you found then, were there any poets in particular that influenced you?
Yeah, it was Gunnar Ekelof, the Swedish poet, and it was Tadeusz Rojewicz, the Polish poet. They were these little slim, I think they were published in the 1970s, Penguin European Poetry series. And then I think it was the Norton Anthology of American Poetry. And I think I felt, I honestly had no context. I mean, when I first met some of the poets in London, I remember asking questions that were, probably a credit to me in their stupidity and naivety. Like, I didn't understand line breaks. I would say, why are these poets, where there's not a rhyme scheme, say, creating line breaks here? Is it just instinctual? And everyone would say, yes, I think so. No one had a sense of why. Or if I asked people to tell me what poetry was without being priggish or Socratic, they would be like, well, is based in language. And I felt very inspired by the fact that I felt everyone was pretending they knew things they didn't know. I thought there was an enormous space for me to go in and do some work there to find out things in an autodidactic way. So in reading these poems, especially like Ekelof is this post-surrealist, elusive, mystical kind of wry writer, and Rejewicz is this kind of concentrated, ethical, paradoxical, immediate writer. I was like, these are registers of speech. These are like patterns of my thoughts. And before I'd thought that artifice had dominated all poetic language, which, arguably it has.
Sometimes does.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it still does for most people, I think. So It was an inspiring thing to find something that was not simplistic or immediate or accessible. I think if I'd have found poets who were comforting or emotionally insightful, I would have been repulsed and I would have thrown those books in the bin. But actually, because I found poets who I thought were intellectually opaque, I was incredibly attracted, because that's how I felt that my own internal psychological experience of language was: confusing, contradictory, and paradoxical.
So would you say you do poetry in order to find out what poetry is?
That's an interesting question. I feel like I actually do know what poetry is. I mean, I often say this when I'm teaching, and to provoke people, because I think that a lot of the issues with the way people feel trapped in the potentials of their poetic practice or their creative practice is because they feel they're not allowed to do things. I think permission is an enormous part of contemporary poetry and its limitations and potentials. And so I say to people, I'm willing to put my flag in the sand. I think poetry is the art of a language art which uses language, the material of communication, for something that is not directly communicative or informative. So that's a very, very broad definition, but the primary purpose of poetry as a language art is not to try and communicate something literal or provide information. That seems to me to be a useful starting point with all of its fraught limitations. And so I actually don't think I'm trying to use poetry as a way to find out what it is. I don't think I actually care about poetry very much. I think I'm actually just using poetry as a vehicle to try and be more content. I think about that often, almost daily. How will my writing, my publishing, my performing, my organizing actually improve my existence on this planet, knowing that I conceive my existence as complex, strange, paradoxical, and confusing?
In the first episode of this podcast, I spoke with Christian Book, and we talked a lot about the dichotomy of an expressive lyrical impulse in poetry and then a more detached generative impulse. So, for example, both Christian and I would firmly be in that second group. We use rules to almost channel something that's beyond us, and we're not trying to convey any feelings or identity. It's more about just using language itself and seeing what language gives us. I think I'd probably say that you'd be in that camp too.
I find any direct expression of emotion or opinion in poetry not to be necessarily a failure in the wider literary sense, but to be, to my personal taste, extraordinarily boring. And so then anyone who does the opposite and engages with contextual manipulation as well as content manipulation, i.e. setting rules, working within form, constraint, working within the breakdown of sound, the visual element of language, the performative potential of language, collaboration, any of those contextual manipulations, that's what attracts me, is being able to balance content and context. And so I have enormous admiration for specialists, which I think you are a wonderful specialist, and Christian too is a brilliant specialist. No, sincerely so. Arguably yourself and Philip Terry are the finest contemporary constraint-based writers, and that's very sincere. But for me, I'm a jack of trades. I'm a master of none. I don't have the patience to be a good constraint-based writer, although I use constraint when it fits my purpose. And I think my purpose is trying to create an active engagement with paradox. Because I find that to be pleasing. That I'm interested in mystery. I'm interested in making my poem more confusing than conversation. Not more insightful, less insightful, because that has its own kind of insight. So any kind of contextual manipulation that helps me do that, I'll use it and then discard it.
You've made a lot of visual poetry, which I see as something very closely related to constraint-based poetry. What do you say to people who are skeptical about visual poetry actually being poetry?
I think that if they're coming from a perspective of just purely talking about how we label certain artistic creations, and they're going to use a different word like text art or, you know, whatever they want to use, like art writing or something like that, then it's irrelevant, right? It's just a different name for the same thing. But if they're actually talking about something deeper and they're saying, it's not a valid kind of poetics, then I would take them to be ignorant about the history of human culture and civilization, where almost ubiquitous practice of using the written monkey signs we call language in a depiction, in a compositional way. It's in the history of almost all religions. It's in the history of cave painting. The history of the human language written is the history of visual poetry. So I would just suggest that they are not familiar with the information that I'm familiar with. That's what I would say.
It's the first poetry in a way, I guess you could say.
I think it is the first poetry, apart from that which we can't know happened, which is the sonic or the sound, which can't be recorded. So yeah, I mean, who knows what came first? It's a Derridian chicken and egg kind of thing.
Would you consider yourself an avant-gardist? Do you like that term?
I've fluctuated in my relationship with that term. Early on, when I was a little bit naive, although I was still trying to be surreptitious in my views to most people, I started saying vanguardist. You know, it's just the English translation of avant-garde, as a way to kind of, knowing that the words are just connotations anyway, that they mean different things to different people, and that a lot of people take the avant-garde to be like a failed project, because again, I think they're viewing it from their own perspective with their own interests, which there's nothing wrong with that. I've got my own interests, everyone does. I used vanguard to kind of create a distance, because I liked the original metaphor of what avant-garde was, a military term, as the people who are the front line, who get shot first. You know, that's always what I say to my students. It's like, it's about being future facing, and this is the term I've started to use instead of avant-garde, which a few people very generously, like Paul Hawkins, have picked up as useful. But I think generally I would associate myself with the avant-garde, because to me, they're often perceived as, shall we say, the avant-garde creates nouns, not verbs. It's a process. Being avant-garde is just being open to the future. It's just being open to methodologies which might not be within conservative tradition, and I mean conservative in the non-political sense. So it's such a relative term, it's almost useless, but in a way, I'm just as suspicious as those who use it as a badge of honor as I am for those who completely refute it like it's something that it isn't. So I'm happy to have it, because in England I am an avant-gardist. Just by the nature of my own country's tradition, I am an avant-gardist, but I think it can be extremely limited, but then I think every designation can be. How about yourself? Because it's a very interesting position with formal or constraint-based writing, right? Because in a way, it's one of the most powerful, and at times in the past of British poetry, especially, formal writing dominated and killed off all of the kinds of poetic conceptions in the minds of the most famous poets. And you're obviously a formal writer. Do you see yourself as an avant-gardist, Anthony?
Well, this is the difficulty. I liked what you said about avant-gardists wearing it as a badge of honor, and I have been annoyed by people who do that. I'm kind of skeptical if a poet can be an avant-gardist. They can certainly do avant-garde things. For example, I use constraints and I like forms, which means I'll invent new forms and I'll do lots of things that would be considered avant-garde. Yet at the same time, if the mood takes me, I might just write a Petrarchan sonnet. So I don't know if that makes me an avant-gardist or a traditionalist. I think I'm just a formalist. But then, as you said, perhaps being avant-garde is being open. And by that definition, I guess I am avant-garde.
Yeah, and then that worries me, because then what if I was to take the mantle of avant-garde, am I suggesting those that we might conceive as mainstream don't have those moments when they go and do things that I think are experimental? You know, it's a problem. I worry about that, a kind of judgment. You know, Edwin Morgan or you know, many poets I can think of who have got a lot of mainstream success, then were also brilliant experimenters with poetry. And I also worry about people who define their identity on that which is as avant-garde, and they fall into a social circle and a pattern and a kind of a group of publishers and a kind of performance where they, even if they don't actually organically want to do that kind of work anymore, they have to, because that's their label, their identity is in being avant-garde. And I worry about all the time. I think, exactly, if I want to write emotional poetry in the future, it's very unlikely, but I reserve the right to do whatever I want to do, so
Yeah.
can I claim avant-garde when really it's about a group of crazed French World War One veterans? That's kind of what it's about. I wouldn't, but people put it on me a lot in England because I won't stand up, cough, and read a poem about my experiences watching a butterfly, so it becomes ridiculous in a way, as a label. So yeah, I'm worried about that because no one's ever going to call me mainstream, but at the same time, do I want to be someone who's avant-garde? And I think the result is to just ignore it, not to think about it too much.
Going back to what you say then about lyrical poetry in the UK, you've said to me previously that you find it's different in Europe, that Europeans are perhaps more open to this generative avant-garde, indeed, poetry.
100%, yeah. I'm always aware that maybe as an outsider, I have like a confirmation bias, but I think I have had experiences when I collaborate or I work very closely with poets doing very similar work to me in countries like Germany, Austria, Switzerland, France, Scandinavia to a certain extent, Poland to a certain extent. I literally am talking to the people who have won the equivalent of the biggest prizes in their country, doing hardcore conceptual poetry, really intense language poetry, sound poetry, visual poetry. There is absolutely a complete different tradition, even to a certain extent that in, say, a country like Austria, the more avant-garde tradition is so dominant over the lyrical tradition that the lyrical tradition holds the position that experimental work does in the UK, in that they're always moaning that they don't get any respect because their work is overlooked for being too emotional. And I think the reason for that is, not to go off on one, but it's because of political history. I think it's about the Second World War. A country like Germany cannot maintain the same respect for the lyrical tradition of poetry after Nazism and fascism. They have to break language itself apart and rely on poets like Paul Celan and Bertolt Brecht and Enzensberger and all these people who are massively sensitive to the power of language for negative ends, whereas a country like England can maintain a kind of status quo around language itself and the poetic tradition because of their perception of moral, which arguably they absolutely are, the moral side of that conflict. And I think that affects the whole of the later 20th century, that each nation's poetry tradition is based on its political history. America's tradition is about the ebullience and the growth of the post-war industrial boom, etc., etc. So I think it's just about culture and history. And I do actually think that in Europe, it is just completely different because of that reality.
One of your many jobs or roles in the poetry world is director of the European Poetry Festival. Would you like to talk about that for a moment, what it is and what you're trying to achieve?
Sure, thank you. So the third one is 2020, is in 3 months' time, April 2020, and it basically evolved out of many years of my event organizing, which began with a desire to invite people from outside of England to the UK and have them collaborate with UK-based poets in order to create literal communities and connections, because I noticed that poetry people in the UK or readers had no sense of any European poetry now. They only knew the big titanic figures of the post-war period. And I saw loads of amazing work happening in Europe. So I invited the European poets. When I put them on, no one came to the readings because they didn't know who they were. So I started pairing them with British poets by accident. And this created amazing collaborative and generative experiences, which led to this project called Enemies, which ended up with me going around the world, organizing events in over 25 countries. And it was just a good time for me to consolidate that energy into one part of the year and start a festival focused on European poetry, because I'd accrued all this expertise about what's happening in these scenes in most countries in Europe, and I had all the ties to the different embassies and international agencies. So it was really a way of me consolidating a lot of energy around something I was passionate about, which is the contemporary European poetry scene. And the first 2 years were a huge success because of the political context that we're in the UK. I think people felt coming to my events, even though the work was very challenging, strange, performative and collaborative, that they were actually kind of enacting a political will by supporting European poets, which, yeah, I'm suspicious about, but it's benefited my festival massively. What's happened, the horror of the context of our political situation in the UK at the moment.
This podcast will go out towards the end of February, but of course today, the day we're recording, is the 31st of January.
Yeah.
So this is the end. These are the end days, the end times. How will that affect things?
I don't know. I think that everyone feels this way. I think the issue of Brexit itself is a whole other discussion that I don't really want to get into, because people talk about it so much, and especially with me running the festival, they ask me so much as though I have some sort of insight to it, which I have none. I think that in the longer term, my hope is that optimistically, that literal political big P divide between us and continental Europe increases a sense of awareness, sensitivity, and desire for European culture, and therefore poetry, because of its perceived absence. So I hope, in a way, it makes my festival have a purpose it wouldn't have had before, and brings more attention to the great poets who are working. But I have no other goals in any way, utopian or otherwise, about my festival. I definitely don't do it because of some I don't do anything because of politics and political opinion. No work and no organization. It's just because a lot of those poets are my friends. They're people I admire. I'm always wanting to find new people, and I want to put them on because it's fun, and it's now become my job. And that's the only reason. So I'd do it, Brexit or not.
And yeah, and you do a lot of other things. I was
Thanks.
This morning I was looking again at your website. There's a lot there. Do you not sleep?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I've thought about this a lot, how much I do. And I just try to make sure I don't do anything because I'm in a mode of being manic or being prolific. It's what suits my energy. It keeps me happy. I think carefully about everything that I do. And this is just, I've realized after 9 years or 10 years, this is my natural pace, is to start lots of projects, respond to lots of projects, create new avenues, and try and work in every way that might make me feel contented. And if it doesn't, I just don't do it again. But so far, I just feel incredibly lucky to have so many opportunities and ideas and collaborators, and I just feel like really happy doing what I'm doing now, and I can always slow down a bit. So
yeah, so you say you do it because it makes you happy, but you've also then, I suppose by accident, become very good at meeting new people and finding new projects, and in a sense marketing poetry, which is a really hard thing to do. I mean, I've found that out. Poetry is a marginalized art form, and I guess a lot of the stuff that you and I do is even marginalized for poetry.
Yes.
Do you have any advice for poets if they want to get their name out there?
I think that I would say a couple of things without going too deep. That precisely because poetry doesn't exist as something that could be marketed, somehow you have to respond to that reality. For example, poetry is 90% subsidized. It doesn't operate in an economic market the way other things do, and therefore being aware of communities, being aware of human connections, being aware of the avenues that already exist are more important than just flinging things out into the world. I'm really mindful that actually I probably only am so active in, say, keeping a good website, sending newsletters, tweeting about my own work, precisely because I know it's so unpopular. I say to my students all the time, I work hard to have the freedom to write whatever I want, because what I want to write is incredibly uncommercial. No one will ever buy thousands of my books. I will never be commercially successful. And so actually there's a paradox at play. I work hard to keep my work unpopular because I don't want to change the content of it in a way I know I could that would make people want to buy it and read it more, because I'm doing it for me. I'm not writing for any reader ever. I don't care about that. I'm writing for me. And therefore, I need to work really hard to keep having the opportunity to write for myself. So the first thing I would say to any poet who's like sharing their work is think hard about your relationship to what you want. And the second thing is the difference between people, I think, who are content while writing poetry and who give up and disappear is expectation. Have no utopian goals. Don't think that you're going to change any scene or convince people one way or another about the efficacy or quality of your work, because what I've noticed is, and we all want this, and I feel it all the time, my new book, I want it to sell, I want people to praise it, but that's healthy, that's normal. You create something, you want to get recognition, there's nothing wrong with that. But what I've witnessed in having friends who have been really successful commercially while I haven't is that the line always moves. I've seen people who have got big book deals and get great success, and then they feel slighted that they don't win a prize. The line always moves. It's an internal experience. So if you start thinking, I just want to get a book out, I just want to meet people, I just want to read, you'll be forever contented. And if you know who you are as a creative person, as a poet and as an artist, then you stick with that, you can kind of never go wrong. Although that's completely glib and ridiculous, but that is what I would say. Those two things, I put myself through that every day.
Yeah, I mean, it might be one of those easier said than done things.
Yeah, exactly. Constant failure. But the difference between starting from a perspective where you think, oh, my book of radical experimental language poetry is going to be really successful and I'm going to get recognized, it's never going to happen. It hasn't happened to me, and I've been chalking away at it for ages. It's just the reality is that we all have a self-perception that, it's all about what we expect and what we think. And I think if you're true to what you really want to write, whatever it is, and you mediate your expectations to human experiences, you can't go wrong. But yeah, you're right. I fail with that all the time. I get really pissy and jealous, and just like everyone else does.
Yeah. I mean, well, putting aside sales and money and fame, what about the idea of legacy? Do you ever think about that? Do you ever think about people 100 years from now looking back at what you did and having been influenced by it? Or is that something else you try not to think about?
Oh, it's just such a great question. In a way, to answer in the affirmative is to be an egomaniac, but what I would say is that I had the opportunity. In fact, actively what I did, I've talked to a few people about this, is when I first came into poetry, I sought out a series of poets who were much older than me, who were over the age of 70, shall we say. And I tried to build a friendship with them because I wanted to see what it looked like to walk the path that I was starting on for a lifetime. So people know the influence that Tom Rayworth had on my work. And I had the opportunity to visit him and his wonderful wife, Val, for a couple of years and have dinner with them and often and become a friend. And same with Anselm Hollow, same with Thomas Shalamun. And I would sit with them and I would ask them and I would listen and I would say to myself, if everything goes as good as it's going to go, this is the result. Are they content with a life spent writing this kind of work? And the answer is varied to a certain extent. What I learned is that there was going to be bitterness and disappointment ahead of me, even from these people who were really wonderful, magnanimous, wise people. I did get the sense that they were disappointed that there was no overall recognition for their unbelievable work. So I had to put into place these checks and balances at that moment that I just described. So I honestly think it's really very, very likely that there will be no legacy to my work, that I will be an extremely minor figure in the British poetry scene of the early 21st century, that people won't really know my books, that they'll go out of print, they'll stay in a box, and if I have kids, maybe they'll not pulp them, and that would be okay. If anything else happens, then that's a bonus, and I'm not trying to sound glib, but I really think every day about the fact that we all expire and I'm going to be dead anyway. So I cannot let that be a motivation. So I'm sorry that's a long-winded answer to your question, but when people work for legacy, I think they put themselves in a trap. So yeah, it has crossed my mind, but I try not to think about it, as you said.
Have you ever thought about starting a poetic movement? I mean, that seems to be one way of combining a lot of things you're interested in, and also maybe having a legacy, even though you don't care.
It has crossed my mind a few times, and what I also experienced early on in poetry was people who were building cults of personality while claiming ethical superiority over other people, you know, in the manner of Andre Breton. It's not to say that they're not talented, but they absolutely wanted to have a group of kind of like, I don't want to use a pejorative word, but like, you know, acolytes or followers. And I think that's the same spirit as thinking that you can create a poetic movement, even though Dadaists and Futurists and Surrealists were all self-promoters and they created their own critical reception. So if that's the tradition, there's nothing wrong with the self-promotion part of it. I just think my personality, I'm already aware I can be quite didactic and quite dominant. So I try not to be. I don't want to be that person who is bringing that kind of energy to them. I think I would rather check myself and worry that I need to make sure I don't have anyone who copies me or follows me or looks up to me. And I don't have any like grand visions of poetic movements, even though sometimes it's tempting to try and bring attention to my work and also to the work of at least 100, 200 people in this country who are brutally overlooked. I mean, I could start a list of names right now off the top of my head of people who are writing the most unbelievably intelligent and brilliant, pure, modern, contemporary, responsive poetry who can't even get, you know, any attention, the smallest piece of recognition, a review. That is tempting to say, you know what, let's consolidate it. But instead of doing it with a poetic movement, I just try and put those people on at events and I try and support them. That's why often I keep organizing. So it's a great question because that has crossed my mind and no one's ever asked me that before.
And it's a great answer. I mean, Andre Breton is more famous than any of his poems.
Yes.
You know, people know who he is. Most people have heard the name at least, but they couldn't read one of his poems to you. So maybe it's best if we just let the work stand for itself.
I think you're right. I think it's a battle internally that we all have, you know. It must cross your mind sometimes too, you know. Well, let's say it in less sophisticated terms than you gave me. Your ability to relate your work through the medium of social media is really actually gives me a bit of hope, because when I see your social media, it's creative. I'm constantly getting this sense that you're using the platform in a completely contemporary way to create new things that people can engage with, rather than shellacking people with a limited, you know, vision of an opinion. And so to a certain extent, I imagine it must sometimes cross your mind that it would be so easy to draw a lot more attention by changing the tone of that or using the medium in a different way. And I've seen some people fall into that. And I wonder, does that occasionally cross your mind? You know, I could easily make myself better known by creating a different tone of expression.
How? Tell me.
Yeah, well, let's not go into that, but yeah.
I don't know. I think sometimes I've noticed that if I just unintentionally say something controversial, then that does bring a lot of attention my way, but it's not necessarily always good attention.
Yeah, that's it.
So I tend to just post poems, but I mean, there's a real ego struggle there with just posting poetry. If I post 3 poems a day, you know, every single one of those poems I'm looking at thinking, well, that's only got 5 likes, that's only got 20 likes, whatever. Or this one's got 200. And then there are these problems where a poem of mine will get 200 likes, but it won't be a poem I like. So I think, well, so should I put that in the book or not? Because I don't really like it, but it seems like other people do. And you can just drive yourself mad with these things. I would recommend posting poems on Twitter, but it's it's fraught.
I think it's interesting. I think it's one of those things that you have to start committing to as like a real engagement with the medium, and you've started that. So I think you should definitely keep doing it, you know, because you've built momentum and awareness with that. But I think starting that process, almost like posting poems on Instagram or something, I think it has to happen organically, and I think it has done with your work. So you should really keep doing it, because I love seeing it. when I flick onto Twitter, where most people for me are muted, you're not muted. I mean, even some of my best, some of my best friends are muted because I just don't want to catch some nonsense that then makes me feel sad afterwards. But every time I'm seeing your work up on there, I'm like, oh shit, this is actually. I realize it's made out of language. Oh, there is something poetic happening here. So that it gives people hope. You know, if you think you're shouting into the darkness, you're not.
Oh, thank you. There are some good poets on Twitter, and there are also some bad ones. And this is, I guess, one of the problems with social media. It's the sheer volume of it. There's so much.
This is the thing very rarely discussed when we talk about the open democratic possibilities of the internet. We also then don't talk about quality control. And no one wants to talk about quality control because it means in some sense you have to be mean. I've noticed this about the whole poetic scene in general. You know what I mean? I don't want to be the one who makes that decision. And that's precisely why there's the problem. Or I don't want to write criticism. I don't want to say who I think is bad. But because none of us will do that ever to a certain extent, that does mean that a lot of people who probably aren't very interesting do get a lot of attention sometimes. But maybe that's just a permanent state of being.
Yeah, I mean, I don't write reviews, but as someone who runs a press, I do have to send out rejection letters, and that's not very nice.
How do you go about doing them?
I have a standard one that I send out, which it's probably the coward's way out. But having to still having to press send, it's not a very nice feeling, especially when it's someone whose work I generally like. It's just the book isn't right for us.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's it. It's one of the downsides of being able to provide people with opportunities is that other people, you have to close the door for them, but that's okay, I think.
Just briefly going back to the subject of a legacy, I don't know why I'm fixated on it. Probably it's more about me than you. You will have a legacy in some sense because you teach poetry.
Yeah.
How do you go about that? Are you trying to teach people objective rules, or are you more trying to encourage people to explore opportunities?
Yeah. Probably the latter, but if I'm honest, yeah, I mean, this has been a huge preoccupation because I've tried to take it very seriously as a job, like pedagogy itself, like what is teaching, how does teaching work? My job before I did anything to do with poetry was a lot of it was based around teaching martial arts. So I had like this big pedagogical experience of how to teach martial arts and think about it conceptually, because there's an end point. If when you're teaching martial arts it doesn't work, you find out really, really quickly. So you have to learn to be a good teacher with something where it has a definitive end point. Whereas I got into poetry and I was looking at creative writing, and I don't have a PhD and I don't have any teaching qualifications, and every single teacher or colleague that I saw did it differently. And I was confused and kind of insecure. So I went on a couple of years of a journey, really, where I tried to find out about theatre pedagogy, music pedagogy, all the different ways that people teach things. And I've kind of ended up settling on something which is based around method. I don't teach examples. I don't criticize or analyze many texts. I present the students, when I'm able to control the content of the course, a series of ideas around the way in which we might create a poetry that reflects their own authentic internal language, knowing that the end point after doing it for 6 years now is going to be something completely different for every person and completely different than anything I do. And that's been the way that I've realized I might be onto something. And I've had the opportunity to then go and teach in different countries at festivals and do lots of different seminars and adult education courses at places like the Tate Modern, and test out all these ideas, teaching with a method-led system. And it seems to work well because it's very tailored, it's very individual, it's slightly provocative, it's quite conceptual, but it's not theoretical. I talk quite deeply, it's conversational, but I don't take any recourse to theory, and I never throw a poem up on the PowerPoint and say, oh, so here in line 3, here we see what, because it's just not what I'm doing. So, for example, my course at the end of the 3rd year at Kingston Uni, where I've taught, I literally introduced them to basic linguistic ideas, and then I fly through language poetry, Dada, constraint poetry, sound, visual, asemic, collaborative, psychogeographical. I just pick a different thing each week. I touch on it, I give them background, I give them a few examples, and then I let them and support them go on their own journey. And so, yeah, that's why I've taught your work, because the week of constraint and Ulipo. Yeah,
I hope it didn't put them off.
No, definitely so far they're all still there, although they have to be. But yeah, so I've thought about it a lot, and that's what I've ended up doing, but maybe I'll change that.
One question I want to ask everybody on this podcast is, how do you compose a poem, like specifically? Because I know how I do it. I know that I apply a rule and I pick a theme and I stick them together and do something. I get the feeling this is going to be a very difficult question with you, because what type of poetry? Because you do so many different things. So I guess it has to have a meta quality to it. But how do you choose what kind of poem you're going to make?
So I would say I retrofit my method to my subject. So I often work in response to either an overarching subject that my book is going to be about, or a commission, or a live scenario. So first I'll set the conditions of what I'm trying to write about, or perform about, or depict. And once I've done that, then I try and find the best method for the meaning. And that's what I teach also my students. I ask them in the first lesson, when I meet them, I say to them, write down 3 things you'd like to write about, and it can't be yourself. And so I get them to pick things in the world that they want to explore and excavate with poetic tools. So first I'll pick my tool, and then once I've picked my tool, then I'll know how I'm going to write it, either through research, either through deliberately getting out of self-awareness, carrying my notebook around so that I can write it on the bus, or having a hot bath so all the blood goes to my brain and getting out and then seeing what comes out. Or I'll be using a certain design software for visual stuff, or certain recording equipment, or so I'll let the environment define the method after I've picked a subject. And that's how I work. That's why I see my work as that's why it's industrious, because I see it as work. I work at it 8 hours a day, and it's just work. It's just brilliant work. I'm just very lucky to do a beautiful job. So yeah, that's how I do it.
And I guess the variety of it is what makes it fun.
Exactly.
It's a constant journey and constant experimentation.
Yeah.
I might have to try that myself, get beyond just this small area I've carved out.
Yeah, but you're a master of that area. You know, that's the thing. It's taken me a long time to not feel like I'm failing, because I'm so sporadic and varied. You know, it does make me feel at times like I really am a jack of all trades and I've mastered nothing, because I move on to the next thing straight away. But the reality is that's kind of how I'm wired, and I need to embrace that, as we all do. So I think you found something you're obviously wonderfully committed to and passionate about, that you're very, very good at. And so, yeah, it's always good to try things, but who we are on the inside is what defines how we write, I think.
So, well, let's talk about what you're doing at the moment. What's coming up for you? In particular, there are 2 books that you've got coming out soon. One I'm bringing up for very selfish reasons. We'll get to that. Before we talk about that one, your next book has a wonderful title. It's published by Dostoevsky wannabe, and the title is "I Will Show You the Life of the Mind on Prescription Drugs."
That's right.
So that's a great title.
Thank you.
What can you tell me about the title and the book itself?
So the book is quite ambitious, I think. It's basically a strange mix of prose-ish poetry, found text, strange source material, strange poems, strange fiction, which basically tells a narrative story about someone who has an unnamed depressive episode, although it might not be medical, clinical depression, and goes to an NHS doctor, and the journey of them being given or choosing to have prescription drugs and how it affects their neurological and emotional well-being. And it comes from quite a few years of being interested in how the brain and language operates, and also my experience of knowing increasing amounts of young people and friends who are on prescription medication, and how little that's talked about, and how little the consequences or the effects of that are mentioned, with things like memory loss and self-perception being fundamentally altered in millions of people that no one really talks about as a possible effect on our society. So it's a really weird book because you can kind of choose your own path through it, through the different medications, but also you can't, because the end result is always kind of bad, which is like my work in general. And so, yeah, it's funner than it sounds, but it's also ambitious. And the title, I think it's from the Coen brothers, Bart and Fink, when John Goodman, which is one of my favorite films, is running down a burning hall screaming, "I will show you the life of the mind." I always thought that was brilliant.
I remember that scene, yeah.
It's incredible, right? John Turturro and John Goodman. It's like an amazing scene because, John Turturro is this pretentious pseudo-Marxist writer telling John Goodman, the traveling salesman, how the working man lives. And John Goodman is actually that man who happens to be a serial killer and screams as he's chasing him with a shotgun. I really am obsessed with titles. I spend so much time on my titles. I love them. I think they're like mini poems. So I'm quite proud of it. Yeah, I will show you the life of the mind. Brackets on prescription drugs seems to kind of bring the whole book together. So yeah, that's the etymology of it.
Well, I'm terrible with titles, and I hate having to come up with them. Yeah, my last book, the title was the last thing I did, and it was completed way after all the content.
Well, I think your titles are good, but yeah, I have a whole document of alternative titles and non-used titles. I have about 50 waiting for books. So yeah, I love them.
That's the opposite of me. You know, I write a poem and then I'm annoyed with myself for having written the poem because now I've got to come up with a fucking title.
Untitled by Anthony Etherin. Untitled.
So you have some poems with you from the wonderfully titled new book. Would you like to read read as many as you like? I think.
Thank you. So I have a little sequence. It comes about a third of the way through the book, called Computer Assisted Web Interviewing for Your Chronic Brain Condition, brackets, Survey Monkey. Question 1. You walk into a house, perhaps it is your house, and none of the dishes have been done. The bedroom is plastered. There are clothes everywhere in every awful corner. It has all been paid for. There is a weasel, it is dead of course, taxidermied, eating your cigarettes. They remain rowed up like bodies in their case. Naturally, your eyelids twitch. You notice the underwear is all dirty, but it is dry now. There are fake 5-quid notes in your fridge. And the person you thought you loved, who has never loved you, has bought you a soda stream machine. You have a blue slush puppy in your hand. Happy birthday. Do you A, clean up, or B, burn the house down? Question 2. You are travelling. There has been a question, a ticking of a box. Do you journey for work or for leisure? You think, inevitably, about how simple the world would be if you could separate the two. And then it occurs to you, you no longer know what the latter means. Leisure. It sounds menacing to you now, a concept with faint smells of totalitarianism. But what you don't know is you're thinking that because you are a soft blurt, a moaner. You have read too much and been pampered so hard that you no longer realize how easy your breakfast is. What gradually burns your throat is a lozenge of love to others, to most. Your weather is patient, your pressure is light. Your frog plays fair with the whims of small farmers and other peasants. You barely know what work means. So how could you understand leisure? Do you A, journey inward, or B, keep pretending as you munch your pills, this is all working out for you? Question 3. You're 16 and you hear about existentialism from Sasha Grey. Only you're not 16, you're 35 and you're messing around with other people's lives. You are attractive only because you are old. What you are is neither fair nor neutral, so you have a decision to make. You hold your face in your hand in a car park of a place that calls itself a bistro. But it is in the Midlands, so you hear a man in a raincoat say bistrot. You check your phone and contribute to a charity which saves donkeys. You passionately no longer think what you once thought. You wish you hadn't come to the doctor. You have lots of other things to do. Do you A, remain still, or B, subscribe to my mailing list? I'll stop with those happy poems. That'll do. 3 of those happy poems.
Very good, very entertaining,
Thank you.
Despite the sadness underneath them.
I hate to say it, but they are probably the more entertaining poems of the book. So, yeah.
Well, so this is I Will Show You the Life of the Mind on Prescription Drugs, which I think is actually out now, as in now when the podcast airs. And you have another book coming up this year.
I'm very happy about that.
In the summer. Well, I'll let you talk about it then.
No, please, you talk about it, Anthony. That would make me happier. Yeah, award-winning crayon poems.
Yeah.
From the finest press in England.
Yeah, I think so. So, would you like to describe this?
Yeah, it's a book I've been working on for quite a long time, actually. It's another in my series of what I've termed poem brew books, which engage with the notion of the possibilities of the handwritten, the colourful, the messy, the negative aesthetics in language poetry, in the reduction of what we might take to be childish mark making in our daily life as adults being a path to poetic potential. So it's a book of poems or illustrative poems that are entirely made using only crayons. I'm quite excited about it.
Award-winning crayon poems from Penteract Press coming this summer. Steven, thank you for coming on the podcast. It was wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you, Anthony. Yeah, I really appreciate the invitation. It's lovely to have a chat with you, and thanks for your generous questions.
To discover more, visit us at penteractpress.com.